You just fixed it, just write 17.
Yeah, no, I'll do it.
That's really on.
I'll do it. It's easy.
Ready?
Yeah.
Good morning. We begin by thanking our sponsors. Sponsorships for today, for the month. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Mar Cheshvan, Yankee and Lisa Statman and Yitzhi and Rebecca Statman in commemoration of the first yard site of Menucha, Shendel Yehudis Bas David Yosef, Zechariah Levracha, as well as Shmuel and Robin Karabkin in commemoration of the 25th yard site of Robin's mother, Melanie Salman, Alea Shalom, Hessa Miriam Bas Chaim. We also thank the sponsors of the Week of Learning, Jeff and Debbie Schwartz, in commemoration of the 5th yard site of Debbie's mother, Shulamit Bas Shmuel. The neshamas should have an aliyah, and the family should have a nechama. We're going to begin today's daf Yud Zayin, Maseches Nedarim. We're actually going to start from the Mishnah, which is 6 lines in on daf Yud Zayin. We got up to the Mishnah yesterday. We're going to start a brand new Mishnah today, which is a continuation of the previous sugya. So we mentioned yesterday, or at least according to most Rishonim, it seems like the Mishnah today is a continuation of yesterday's discussion, where yesterday we began a discussion about chumros, or stringencies, that Nedarim have over Shavuos, and stringencies that Shavuos have over Nedarim, and we're going to continue in that discussion, and we're going to say that Yesh Neder B'soch Neder, Ve'in Shvuah B'soch Shvuah. So one of the more strict matters of a Neder is that a Neder can actually double itself up. I'm going to be a little bit vague on what that means because we're going to have to define it very soon. But at least for the sake of the Mishnah, a neder can be doubled up. You can have one neder piling up on top of another neder, but you cannot have another shvuah piling up on top of another shvuah. So again, we differentiate between a neder and a shvuah by a neder being where a person creates a prohibition on a particular item. So you can have 2 prohibitions which are going to be born on one item. However, when it comes to a shavua, since when the person makes a shavua and he takes an oath to do something or not to do something, he is referring to himself. Once the prohibition comes into effect, there is no room. It's already booked. There's no more room for another prohibition to actually take effect on himself. So if there's a prohibition that he has for something, which is a shavua, it's done. It's full. There's absolutely no more room for any more shavua. When it comes to a neder on a particular item can double itself up. There's just so much to say. We'll get this out of the way right away. We're going to have to fight my Yetzer Hara throughout this shir, because this is one of those amudim. When you learn it in yeshiva, it takes a very, very long time. And there's just so much to say on every single line here. Nedarim is one of the yeshiva mesechtas. It's a mesechta which is learned in yeshiva. And the Rishonim spend a tremendous amount of time on this particular amud, debating what exactly each line means. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible and as straightforward as possible. We're going to go with the sheet of the Ran. But I do want to let you know that while the way that we're learning is consistent with the Ran, which is the Rishon that's on the page, there are other ways of viewing almost every line within this Gemara of what exactly it means. So just for example, when we talk about being 2 Nedarim, does that mean that it ends up manifesting itself in 2 consecutive Nedarim? So when the first one is over, the second one takes effect? Or does it mean that at the same time that I have Neder 1 in effect, Neder 2 is in effect as well? So if I were to violate the Neder, I would have to bring 2 karbanos. We're going to go with the first opinion, which is the Ran, which is that it goes consecutive. But I do want you to know, for the sake of honesty, for the sake of intellectual integrity, intellectual honesty, I want you to know that there's many different ways of viewing this. And this is the Masechta of the Gavra and the Chefza. I mean, that's typical yeshivish terminology. The Gavra and the Chefza, understanding that it's something which is relevant to the person, as well as being relevant to the item you're discussing. But there is also a lot of discussion, we're going to talk a lot about Nazirus. There's also a large discussion about the Kedusha of the Nazirus, and separating the Kedusha of the Nazirus and the practice of Nazirus, the Isurim of Nazirus. Again, I'm going to try to hold myself back from allowing that to come out too much in the shir, because I think it makes everything much more confusing. But again, This is a daf shir. We have to be able to finish the daf during this year. But I want you to know, for the sake of honesty, if you have time today, throughout your day, and you're able to find some of the literature on this daf, there's fascinating discussions in the Chazon Ish, the Gra, the Rishonim, the Ramban, the Ritva, which is in the back of the Masechta, and the Ran. He invests a lot of time on this page as well. There's just so much buried in here. But on a simple level, Yesh Neder B'soch Neder means a Neder can be doubled up. The Ein Shvua B'soch Shvua means a Shvua cannot be doubled up. It's one Shvua at a time, and that's it. Once you apply a Shvua, it's like it's booked. You're going to have to come back when we have a vacancy. So that's the difference. Now, the Gemara, the Mishnah goes on and says, Ketzad, how does this work? And the Mishnah says, Amar Hareini Nazir im Ochel. I will become a Nazir if I eat. And then he says that the exact same phrase again. Hareini Nazir im Ochel. I will become a Nazir if I will eat. So again, what strikes you right away about this line? We're talking about a neder. All of a sudden the Mishnah moves on into the world of Nazirus. To be a Nazirite. What does that have to do with anything? Why are we talking about Nazirus over here? And second of all, even more than that, why does he have to make his Nazirus contingent on whether he will eat or not? Talking about a neder, why can't it simply just say, Ketzad, person says, Konam kikar zeh alai. Konam kikar zeh alai. That this loaf of bread should become forbidden to me, and says it twice. So the Mishnah begs a question immediately. Why jump to Nazir? And why make a contingent type of Nazir? This is not my kasha. Everyone asks this question. We're going to see that the Ran addresses this. But ultimately, that's the case that the Mishnah comes up with. That a person says, I will be a Nazir if I eat. I will be a Nazir if I eat. Now, what happens if he eats? So then, he becomes a double Nazir. Double Nazir, the way we're going to explain that is that he starts the Nazirus today, goes a full period of 30 days, and then he starts all over again once he finishes that Nazirus. Now, Shvua shelo ochel, person takes a Shvua that he's not going to eat. I'm sorry, Hareini Nazir mochel, ve'achal, and he ate, chayav okalachas v'achas, he needs to become a Nazir for each one of those eatings. Next, Shvua shelo ochel, a person says twice, he takes a Shvua that he's not going to eat, ve'achal, and then he ate, eno chayav elachas, he's only chayav once. Why? Because a Shvua can only take effect once. Once he activates the first Shvua upon himself that he won't eat, there's no more room for another Shvua, and therefore even if he says it 100 times and he eats, he's only going to be chayav once. That's the Mishnah. Now, just to simply answer the question why we choose the case of Nazir, the reason, and the Rishonim explained this, is the way that we know that a neder can actually take effect twice is because it says in the pasuk Nazir lahazir. In other words, the makar, the source to this halacha is because the pasuk says Nazir lahazir. So that explains to us why the example we gave was by Nazirus. Now, why does he have to make it contingent on im ochel, if I eat? So this is where the Rishonim get into a bit of a differing explanation, but ultimately the answer is that since when it came to Shvua, the way that the Shvua will be explained is by saying a person takes a Shvua that he won't eat. So we wanted to have a consistent language in the Mishnah where when it came to the neder, also talked about eating. So just like when the example of a Shvua that doesn't take effect is when a person says that Shvua, Shelo Ochel, a person takes a Shvua that I won't eat, we also wanted the first case in the Mishnah to be Hareini Nazir im Ochel. But again, it's not actually important that be the case. It just happens to be that is a more consistent, smooth way of writing the Mishnah. Now, we're going to begin the Gemara. The Gemara, according to the Ran that we're learning, is actually missing a number of words. And therefore, I'm going to draw your attention down to the second wide line of the Ran, and we're going to focus on the bold part of the Ran. According to the Ran, the Gemara is just simply missing some text, and it's not there. So therefore, we're going to learn that text from the Ran. If you see that, according to the Ran, the Gemara starts as follows. Kivan da Amar Hareini Nazir. Once he said Hareini Nazir, so Havalei Nazir. V'chi achel tuva umasrin bei. If he goes ahead and eats a lot with a hasra, Mechayev kol achila v'achila. Those are the words that the Ran has in the Gemara. Now, if you look in the Ran, he explains that there are two questions over here. If you go down one line, the word chada, he says there's two questions. Chada, lama li lemit linazirus ba'achila, taha mikivan d'amar harini nazir havli nazir v'chayav l'noshtayim. This is the question that we asked. And according to the Ran, it's actually the Gemara's question. Why does the Gemara have to make the nazirus contingent on eating? Question 2, Vikasha leisu. The Gemara has another question. The itli linazirus ba'achila b'haredi nazirim ochel. We're making the nazirus contingent on him eating. Chada zimna sagile. He doesn't have to say it each time. In other words, the hakaimulam perak shvua shtayim basra the mishnishbash lo ochel kikar zeh al kol zayis v'zayis shavo nishba. In other words, what the Ran is saying is as follows: person takes a shvua that they're not going to eat bread. The understanding is that he's chayiv once he eats a kazayas of bread. So if he eats like one kazayas of bread, he violated his shvua. He sits down to another kazayas of bread, he violated his shvua again. A third kazayas, there's a third violation. If that's the way that it works, says the Ran, then why do you need him to actually say, Hareni Nazir im Ochel, Hareni Nazir im Ochel, once he made the acceptance of Nazirus dependent on him eating, so every time that he eats, he gets a new Nazirus. Why does he have to actually express that he's going to be a Nazir a second time? Once we understand that if a person makes something contingent on his eating, then every time he's going to eat, he's going to have a new Nazirus. That is, according to the Ran, the second question of the Gemara. Now, if you skip all the way down in this large Ran, and you go 3 lines before the end of the Ran, umitarza, and the Gemara answers. You see, it's the third word on a line. Umitarza, aidi dekatani shvua shlo ochel. Since the Mishnah says shvua shlo ochel, deina chinami, devarini nazir harini nazir sagile. It would have been enough if you just said, I'm a nazir. And he says again, I want to be a nazir. The inami tal nazirs bim ochel b'chad harini nazir im ochel sagile el aidi itzrich lemit li shvua b'achila lemichbal banami shlo ochel di'lo pshita shinu chayav ala achas tal nazirs b'achila uvekafle. Says the Ran, ultimately, the Gemara concedes and says it doesn't need to say this. In other words, the Mishnah did not need to say all this. But we wanted it to be smooth with the end of the Mishnah, and therefore we fit it in. In other words, this is one of those cases where, according to some Rishonim, just was a question that the Rishonim had, and they explained it on their own. According to the Ran, it's actually part of the Gemara, it just didn't make it into the publishing house. So I encourage you to focus on that part of the Ran, because according to the Ran, it's actually part of the Gemara. Mirza Hashem, I'm going to make a siyum on Maseches Nedarim. We don't want the Ran to say, I'm not showing up to the siyum, because you guys missed 2 lines in the Gemara. Which is just on this point itself. There's a very interesting shaila in the Rishonim, which can be relevant. Once the Ran explained to us that the Gemara is asking that if a person takes a shvua on a particular item, so he answers himself from eating bread, so every kazayas that he eats starts a new shvua. There's a shaila that the Rishonim have, and it manifests itself in a number of cases. What if a person accepts upon himself that he will give tzedakah? The case that I saw was that if he promises himself not to go to a particular location, he recognizes that location is not good for his ruchnius. He doesn't want to go there. So to give himself a little more chizuk, he says, I'm not going to go there anymore. If I go there, I'm going to give $100 to tzedakah. Now, what happens if he ends up going there twice? Does he owe $100 to tzedakah, or does he owe $200 to tzedakah? And this is actually an interesting shaila, which it's not clear. The Rashash discusses this at length, And he makes it dependent whether you have to have a hasra in between. According to the Ran, it seems like you have to have a warning in between every time that you go, and then you would be chayiv for each time. It's also relevant if a person accepts something upon themselves. And I heard this shaila as well. A person accepts to learn Mishnayos for somebody who passed away. Everybody knows you walk into a shiva house, there's that paper over there for the sign up for Mishnayos, and there are certain masechtas over there that somehow just never get filled out. Right? Now there's one brave guy who's able to learn a Masechtas Midos. I don't know, he's able to learn some of the most difficult masechtas. Now what happens if he goes, he's a shiva hopper. He goes to several shiva houses and he fills out that masechta. Does he have to learn it for each shiva house that he went to? Or could he learn it once and say, hey, listen, I accept upon myself to learn Masechtas Midos or Kalim, and you know what? I'll learn it once and we'll knock it off for everybody. So again, it's also very much dependent on this. It's not very simple that you could just learn it once. So be careful. If you sign that paper a bunch of times, you might have to repeat it a few times. But this is, again, it comes from this sugya over here and from this Ran, that it could be that one acceptance of a neder can actually double itself over. Now we get back to the actual text of the Gemara. Amar Rav Huna. So what's going to happen here, just a little bit of a preview of the Gemara. The rest of the Gemara for today is a line that Rav Huna says. He limits the halacha that a person can double up a neder, and the Gemara is going to try to disprove Rav Huna from a number of cases. So that just keep your focus on that, because the Gemara has to go through a few steps, but ultimately it's really not very difficult. Rav Huna makes a statement, and the Gemara is going to challenge Rav Huna's statement, and that's today's daf. Amar Rav Huna, Lo shanu el adamar hareini nazir hayom, hareini nazir lamachar. Demigu dekami tosef Yomi yasera chayla naziris al naziris. Aval Amar hareini nazir hayom, hareini nazir hayom, ein chala naziris al naziris. Says Rav Huna, while it is true that a person can have a double neder, and the way that we're explaining it is through naziris, it can't be an exact replica of the first neder. You need to add at least something. So says Rav Huna, what's going to be the case? Person says, Hareini Nazir Hayom, which lasts for 30 days. And he says, Hareini Nazir Lamachar. So now he's restarting his Nazirus already during a period when he is a Nazir. So says Rav Huna, if you're starting it during that period, it's going to extend beyond that period till day 31. And then, since you have that extra day there, so then the previous 29 days as well take effect. Right? In other words, let's just get this clear. According to the Ran, when a person accepts 2 periods of time of Nazirus, what happens is he now has to observe 60 days of Nazirus. 30 for the first Nazir, 30 for the second Nazir. Now, if you cannot initiate a Nazirus when a person's already a Nazir, so then the second expression of Hareini Nazir is going to be Dvarim B'Telim. It's going to be nothing. Once we say that a person can initiate Nazirus during a period of Nazirus, so then the second expression of a Nazir can take effect, but says Rav Huna, only if you've added on 1 day. If you added on nothing, then the second Nazirus as well is going to be nothing. That's Rav Huna's opinion. Now, interestingly, the way it works, if you look at Rashi, the Ran says this as well, is that the truth is, when he says, Hareini Nazir Hayom, I want to start being a Nazir today, and I want to start being a Nazir tomorrow, essentially what happens is, the first 29 days really have no effect, because you're a Nazir already. But once the expression of the second Nazirus actually works, and works only for 1 day, you find yourself in trouble. Because there's no such thing as a Nazir for 1 day. So since the minimum time for a Nazir is 30 days, so the truth is, your expression of Nazir only worked for 1 day. But there's no such thing as a Nazir for 1 day. So it stretches itself out for another 30 days. That's the way the Ran explains it. So again, to be clear about Rav Huna, according to Rav Huna, you cannot be a double Nazir at the same period of time. The only way that can work is if you add on another day. Once you're adding on another day, so then the first expression actually works, And consequently, what happens is it extends for 60 days. That's Rav Huna's opinion. Just to see that again inside, Amar Rav Huna, Lo Shanu, our Mishnah was not taught, Ella the Amar Harini Nazir Hayom Harini Nazir Lamachar. I'm becoming a Nazir today, and I'm becoming a Nazir tomorrow. The Migud Dekami Tosef Yoma Yasera. Since you're adding on one day, Chayla Nazirus al Nazirus. The Nazirus can't double itself over and take effect. Aval Amar Harini Nazir Hayom. Harini Nazir Hayom. He said the exact same thing twice. I'm becoming a Nazir today. I'm becoming a Nazir today. The halacha is Ein Chala Nazirus al Nazirus. The second Nazirus cannot take effect during the first period of time of Nazirus. Ushmuel Amar, Shmuel disagrees, and he says, Afil Amar Harini Nazir Hayom Chala Nazirus al Nazirus. Mishnah tells us a neder can be doubled up. So says Shmuel, take the Mishnah at face value. It says you can double up a neder. A Nazirus is a neder, and therefore it can indeed manifest itself twice in one period of time. How do you observe that? According to the Ran, you're going to observe that by observing a second period of 30 days of Nazir. So now the Gemara says, Rav Huna, according to Rav Huna, now we're going to try to disprove Rav Huna's opinion. And we're going to do that by analyzing the Mishnah. Rav Huna, according to you, Rav Huna, Adatana ein shvua betoch shvua, listni yesh neder, besoch neder, ve'ein neder besoch neder. In other words, this is the concept. The Gemara doesn't use this language, but often throughout Shas we find the language of liflog v'lisni bedida, which means if you're trying to teach me a distinction between different types of Nedarim, don't outsource yourself to this is a halacha of neder, this is a halacha in shavua, and then you start comparing the two, because then it starts getting too complicated. Just teach me about Nedarim. If you want to teach me that there's a difference between a double neder and a non-double neder, just say you should just know there are some times when I can have a double neder, and there are some times when I can't have a double neder. And what is that? How is that going to look? Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Lamachar, Yesh Neder B'soch Neder. According to Rav Huna, the only time you could have a double neder is when a person says Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Lamachar. That's an example of when you could have a double neder. However, Hareini Nazir Hayom, turning the page to the top of Yizayim Aveis, Ein Neder B'soch Neder. That's going to be an example of a case when you can't double up a neder. So why do you have to compare Nedarim to Shavuos to say that a neder could be more intense than a Shavuot because a neder can double up and a Shavuot can't double up? Just tell me, you should just know, even in Nedarim itself, sometimes a neder can be doubled up and sometimes it can't. You know what the Gemara says? Kasha. It's a good kasha. In other words, kasha, as we've said many times before, doesn't mean that anything is disproven. It means this doesn't work so well. Is there a way to answer it? Perhaps. Do we have proof that Rav Huna is wrong from the Mishnah? No, we can't prove Rav Huna is wrong because the Mishnah didn't say that. It would have been more convenient. It would have made more sense. It would have been a little more smooth to make this contrast in Neder itself, but the Mishnah didn't. That doesn't prove Rav Huna is wrong. It just doesn't work so well with Rav Huna. In other words, we're not going to discount the fact that it's a kasha, but it doesn't mean that Rav Huna is wrong. Okay, so we'll start again. Try one more attempt at disproving Rav Huna. Tanan. Yesh neder b'soch neder ve'en shvua b'soch shvua. Our Mishnah says that there is a case of a neder b'soch neder. You can have a double neder, but you can't have a double shvua. So the Gemara says, hey chidami. What's the case? And clearly the Gemara is not looking for the answer of the Mishnah of the case of Nazir. The Gemara is understanding that this is relevant in other cases as well. Se'ilema da'amar hareini nazir hayom, hareini nazir lamachar. If Rav Huna is right, that the way that nazir works is by saying, I'm a nazir today, I'm a nazir tomorrow, and then that whole logic that we explained from the Ran of how it ends up working out for 60 days. So then the kavasagabi shvua, shlo ochel te'enim, v'chazav amar shlo ochel anavim. Remember, you're not comparing one case to the next if they aren't parallels. So the Gemara says, if Rav Huna, you're right, that the case of neder is that a person says, Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini nazir lamachar. So then you have to have a parallel comparison by Shavua. You can't just say Shavua shlo ochel, Shavua shlo ochel. That can't be the case because it's not parallel. They don't line up. They have to be the same. The case of Shavua was today and tomorrow, so there needs to be something different. Sorry, if the case of Neder was today and tomorrow, then Shavua also has to be this and that, which is a person takes a Shavua, shlo ochel te'enim, v'shlo ochel anavim, that he won't eat figs and he won't eat grapes. So the Gemara says, Amai lo chal shvua. What's wrong with that? It's two separate shvuos. In other words, if Rav Huna, you're right, that the only time a neder works is when you make two separate nedarim on two separate days. So in other words, a neder manifests itself on days, and a shvua manifests itself on different types of fruit. Why can't that work? What's wrong with having a double shvua? Person takes a shvua not to eat grapes, not to eat figs. That should also work. So Gemara says, Elahechi dami, must be. Elahechi dami de lo chala shvua. What's the case where shvua is not going to take effect on another shvua? Kigon de amar shvua shlo ochel te'enim, v'chazar v'amar shvua shlo ochel te'enim. So he said the same thing twice. In other words, that must be the case. In other words, we must identify a case of shvua where the shvua cannot double itself up. So we'll start on that side. What's the case of shvua? The case of shvua is where a person says, I won't eat te'enim, I won't eat te'enim. So he reiterates, he says the same line twice. And that's the case where the second shvua is essentially just devar b'telim, it's nothing. So then let's go backwards. The kavasa gabin nazirus. What's going to be the parallel case when it comes to a nazir? Heichi dami. De amar, hareini nazir hayom, hareini nazir hayom. Just like when it comes to a shavua, the person says, I won't eat, I won't eat. So nazir is, I'll be a nazir, I'll be a nazir. Vikatani, yesh neder b'soch neder. Mishnah says that there is a neder b'soch neder, that the double neder does work. So again, if you're going to compare the cases, says the Gemara, then you have to have a parallel case. And we already clearly established that when it comes to a shvua, it can't be the person says, I won't eat grapes, I won't eat figs, because of course that's going to work. There's no reason why that shvua should not take effect. There's no halacha, you can only make one shvua at a time. If a person takes a shvua not to eat grapes, and not to eat figs, so then no grapes and no figs. The parallel case of a neder, which is the parallel case of a neder when he says Hareini nazir hayom, Hareini nazir lamachar. So then it must be that the case of shvua that doesn't work is a case where he says the same thing twice. Now, if the case of shavua that doesn't work is when he says the same thing twice, so then if you're going to actually compare that and contrast that to a neder, it has to be said Hareini nazir hayom, Hareini nazir hayom, the same thing twice. So Rav Huna, you must be wrong when you said that the only time a neder can double itself up is when you say Hareini nazir hayom, then Hareini nazir lamachar. So again, you have to hold your head together a little bit for this, but it's not so complicated. Essentially, all the Gemara is saying is that Rav Huna, if you're telling me that the neder 1 and neder 2 have to be a little bit different on different days, so then shvua 1 and shvua 2 have to be a little bit different. And once they're different, so then Rav Huna, it's either going to always work by shvua, or you're wrong about your assumption by a neder. So again, it's a question of Rav Huna. Amalach Rav Huna says no. You're misunderstanding this. Let me tell you how I understand the Mishnah. Masnisan, our Mishnah is talking about Amar Hareini nazir hayom, Hareini nazir lamachar. We know that already because Rav Huna already told us that the only time our Mishnah is going to work is when he adds on one day. So the case is Hareini nazir hayom, I will be a nazir today. Hareini nazir lamachar, I'm going to be a nazir tomorrow. Now the kavasaga b'shvua. What's the parallel case by a shvua? To Amar shlo ochel te'enim. He starts off by saying, I'm not going to eat te'enim. V'chazar v'amar shvua shlo ochel te'enim va'anavim. I'm not going to eat figs and grapes. So the first one was only figs. And then, in the second expression, he included figs again, but he overlapped it with grapes. In other words, that's the way Rav Huna understands it. And in such a case, says Rav Huna, the shvuah is not going to work. The lo chayla. In such a case, the second expression of the shvuah is not going to work. Okay, so that's how Rav Huna understands the Mishnah. So let's just be clear about the way Rav Huna understands the Mishnah. The Mishnah is very vague according to Rav Huna. According to Rav Huna, the Mishnah says, Yesh neder b'soch neder, you can have a double neder. It means a person says, Hareini nazir hayom, Hareini nazir lamachar. What happens according to Rav Huna? He becomes a neder for 60 days now. First he has the first 30 days, he brings his karban, and he finishes up his nazirus, he gets a haircut, and then he starts over his nazirus for a second time. What's the case of shvuah that does not work according to Rav Huna? A parallel case exactly. A person says, Shavua shlo ochel te'enim. A person takes a shvuah not to eat figs, and then he says, you know what? Shvuah shlo ochel te'enim va'anavim. I'm not going to eat figs and grapes. So the second shvuah included both figs and grapes, which essentially was already accomplished. The figs were accomplished with the first shvuah. So now the Gemara asks, hold on, it's still not going to work. Because v'ha'amar Rabba taught us, shvuah shlo ochel te'enim, person takes a shvuah not to eat figs, v'chazar v'yamar shvuah shlo ochel te'enim va'anavim. Exactly this case. He repeats and says, I'm not going to eat te'enim, and I'm not going to eat anavim. V'achal te'enim. He ate te'enim, so he violated his word. What does he do? First karban. He separates a karban to bring for a kapara, to atone for violating his word. Now, this guy couldn't control himself. V'chazar v'yamar, v'chazar v'achal anavim. So now he went ahead and ate grapes. Says Rabba, havalahu anavim chatzi shir, v'emevi'in karban al chatzi shir. Says Rabba, when he went ahead and ate the grapes, he can't bring a karban. Why? Because he already had a kapara on the te'enim before. So now on the anavim, he can't bring a karban because it's a chatzi shir. Chatzi shir means that it's only half of what he assered. In his words, he prohibited himself from grapes and figs. Now when he ate the grapes, he only violated half of his word. Can't bring a karban on half of your word. But the point is, says the Gemara, Alma hecha to amar shvuah shlo ochel te'enim, v'chazav amar shvuah shlo ochel te'enim v'anavim, migu dechal shvuah anavim, chaylanami al te'enim. In other words, what's the reason he can't bring a karban? Because it's a chatzi shir. Chatzi means it's half. By definition, it means there's another half. According to Rav Huna, the shvuah wouldn't have even taken effect. It wouldn't have worked. That's what he says the parallel case. He said the parallel case of shvuah that doesn't work is when you say, I won't eat figs, and then he says, I won't eat figs and grapes. According to Rav Huna, that's the case of shvuah that doesn't work. So why is Rabbi telling me you don't bring a karban because it's a chatzi shir? Chatzi by definition means that there's another half. According to Rav Huna, there's no other half. The shvuah didn't work. So to say you don't bring a karban because the shvuah was nonsense. The shvuah just didn't mean anything. Clearly, the way the Rabbi is explaining this, it does take effect. The Gemara says, Rav Huna was like Rabbi. It's a very nice question, but Rav Huna is not obligated to agree with everything that Rabbi says. And it's true that Rabbi does say that the only reason why there's no karban is because it's chatzi shir. Rav Huna will say, you know why it doesn't work? Because the second shvuah didn't take effect. So we've tried at least twice now to disprove Rav Huna, but it hasn't worked. We had three. So twice. We had two. So now we're on the third one. Meisvei. Misha Nazir Shtei Nazirus. A person took upon himself 2 Nazirus. So whatever the case was. Person, according to Rav Huna, it's where the person says Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Lamachar. According to Shmuel, it's where a person says Hareini Nazir, Hareini Nazir. At least at this point in the Gemara. So he has 2 Nazirusin, Nazirios probably, 2 Nazirios that he has to go ahead and observe. So Mana Sarishona, he did the first one. He observed the first period of Nazirus, Vehifrish Karban, and he took off a Karban. which is part of the process. Part of the process of coming out of Nazirus is bringing a carbon. But then Vinishal Aleh, he decided to reverse it. He went ahead to the Rav, and he was matir neder on his Nazirus, so he uprooted his Nazirus. So again, he took two Nazirus, two Nazirios, he observed one, he brought a carbon for it, and then he said, you know what? Forget it. I want to go ahead and uproot it. So he uprooted the first Nazirus. What's the halacha? Also lo shnia barishona. The first one's gone because he was nishal. He went ahead and reversed it. So the first Nazirus is gone, but he observed a period of time for Nazirus. Says the Gemara, he's got credit for it. He already earned the credit for it because he already observed the 30-day period of Nazirus, so therefore he's good to go. So the Gemara says, hey chitami, how does this case work out? What was the case? Ilema de Amar, Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Lamachar, Amai also lo shnia brishona, Ha'ika Yomi Yasera. According to you, Rav Huna, this is problematic because you told us the only way to effectively have two Nazirios running at the same time is if you add on a day. But if you add on a day, so then how do you get credit for time served if there's one day that wasn't observed? It doesn't work. In other words, according to Shmuel, everything is good because you could have observed the Naziris the words of the Naziris can be about the same time. Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Hayom. So it's good. It's the same 30 days. According to Rav Huna, there needs to be an extra day added over here. So how could it be that when I reverse the first set of Naziros, I could use the credit of that time to the second Naziros? The problem is, there's an extra day that wasn't observed. The Gemara's El Pshita, it must be, Damar Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Hayom. It must be, that Shmuel's right, but Tiyuf to Rav Huna, must be Rav Huna's wrong. But don't get too excited, says the Gemara. No, La'olam, Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Lamachar. Indeed, says Rav Huna, the expression that he used was, I'm going to be a Nazir today, I'm going to be a Nazir tomorrow. What does it mean? Also, what does it mean that those 30 days worked for him? Says Rav Huna, doesn't mean he's completely done. It means he gets credit for the time that he actually observed being a Nazir, but since he has one more day on the line, so serve one more day as a Nazir to finish up what you were missing. Inami, says the Gemara Kagon, Shekibol Shtei Naziros Bevas Achas. This is not the case of Rav Huna or Shmuel. It's not where he says Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Hayom, or Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Lamachar. If you look in the Rashi and the Mefarish, in the second skinny line, the way he says it is, Ta'amar Harei Alai Shtei Nazirus. That's all he says. A person accepts upon himself two Nazirus. So that's it. It doesn't say Hayom, doesn't say Lamachar. He just says, it shall be upon me 2 periods of Nazirus. Lachi Chayiv Shtayim. Ilav Shenishal. Avol, I'amar Hareini Nazir Hayom. Hareini Nazir Hayom in Nazirus Chal al Nazirus. So that's one way of doing it, where he says, Harei Alai Shtei Nazirus. So that avoids Rav Huna's problem, and it avoids Shmuel, and it just essentially means he has to be a Nazir twice. So it says Rav Huna, that case, that price that you brought in, where it says that he basically gets credit for the time that he was observing himself as a Nazir, says Rav Huna, that's totally irrelevant, it has nothing to do with our Mishnah. In that case it can work, even if he doesn't say Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Lamachar. Okay, I think we will stop here. There are a number of interesting Rans. If you have some time, a lot of the Ran here, especially the big long one in Yizayin Amud Beis, he really goes through a lot of the logic. The reason is because when the Gemara goes to the parallels, I didn't really spend so much time on it, but it's not so clear that I would have initially thought that the parallels that the Gemara draws up are the right parallels. There could have been better examples of the parallels. So if you get some time to read through these Rans, that will brighten your day. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Kol Tov. I don't know. Check the schedule. Meeting early.